Marriage feels like the most natural thing in the world, something humans have always done, like eating or sleeping. But for roughly 95% of the time our species has existed, marriage did not exist. No rings, no vows, no wedding day, no word for husband or wife. If you had traveled back 50,000 years and asked someone to point out their spouse, they wouldn't have understood the question. So if marriage isn't some ancient human instinct, what actually forced us to invent it? The real answer has almost nothing to do with love, and everything to do with a discovery so ordinary you probably have some in your kitchen right now. Picture life 50,000 years ago. Small bands of 20 or 30 people, constantly moving, sharing food, sharing shelter, sharing the exhausting job of keeping children alive in a world with no hospitals and no guarantees. Anthropologists studying hunter-gatherer societies that still exist today have documented something called partible paternity, the belief that one child can have multiple biological fathers, all of them expected to hunt for that child, protect it, and treat it as their own. In that world, the question, whose child is this exactly, barely mattered. There was no fortune to inherit, no land to fight over, no name on a deed. If your whole group survives together or starves together, having more people invested in a child is a survival advantage, not a scandal. So what changed? Around 12,000 years ago, in the region we now call the Fertile Crescent, humans did something they had never done in the entire history of the species. Some groups stopped moving. They planted crops, and for the first time ever, they produced more food than they could eat in a single season, stored in pits and granaries that could get a family through winter, or feed a rival raiding party if they got there first. That one shift, a surplus you could store, created a problem humans had genuinely never faced before: ownership. Suddenly there was something worth defending, something worth stealing, something worth handing down when you died. And that single new question, who gets this when I'm gone, quietly changed everything about how humans paired off. Here's the part that tends to catch people off guard. Marriage, in its earliest form, wasn't invented for love. It was invented as inheritance technology. A social contract built to solve one brutally practical problem: paternity certainty. If a man spent decades farming a plot of land specifically to pass it to his children, he needed to know, without doubt, which children were actually his. The loose, flexible, shared parenting arrangements that worked perfectly well for wandering hunter-gatherers suddenly became a genuine threat to a farmer's life's work. Spend 30 years building wealth for a child who isn't biologically yours, and your own bloodline gets nothing. So early farming societies did something nomadic humans never had to do. They started formalizing exclusive pair bonds, publicly and eventually legally, specifically to lock down who belonged to whom. Some of the earliest written evidence of anything resembling a marriage contract comes from Mesopotamia. Roughly 4,000 years ago, clay tablets listing dowries, property exchanges, and family obligations tied to a union between one man and one woman. Not love poems, legal paperwork. Marriage wasn't born from love or attraction or even companionship. It was born from grain silos, inheritance disputes, and one urgent, unavoidable question that simply didn't exist before farming changed everything. When this man dies, whose child inherits what he built? At its core, marriage is one of the oldest pieces of legal infrastructure humans have ever created. Older than most nations, older than most religions in the form we know them today. Engineered to answer a question our hunter-gatherer ancestors literally never had to ask. And here's where the story gets genuinely strange. Marriage wasn't invented once and copied by everyone else. Time and again, societies facing the same challenge independently arrived at remarkably similar institutions. Different languages, different gods, different continents, yet the same basic solution kept appearing. Once humans had wealth that could outlive them, they almost inevitably invented rules about who could form a family, who belonged to it, and who would inherit what came next. In ancient Rome, marriage functioned mainly as a strategic weapon, cementing political alliances, merging fortunes, binding powerful families together, whether the two people getting married had ever spoken more than a few sentences to each other. Wealthy fathers negotiated their daughters' marriages the way modern executives negotiate corporate mergers. Across the ancient world, from early Egypt to early China, completely disconnected civilizations, oceans apart with no contact with each other, independently arrived at strikingly similar solutions to solve the exact same problem: stored wealth that needed an heir. And once you notice that pattern, you start seeing its fingerprints everywhere, including places you'd never expect. The old tradition of a father giving away the bride? A leftover echo of literally transferring ownership from one family to another. The phrase asking for her hand, originally about negotiating property, not affection. Even the diamond engagement ring, often assumed to be some ancient romantic symbol, is barely a century old, a marketing campaign from the 1930s that successfully rebranded a stone as proof of love. We've been layering romance on top of a legal skeleton for so long that most people now genuinely believe the skeleton was built out of romance in the first place. Now, here's the uncomfortable part, the part that quietly rewrites everything you thought you knew about marriage. If it exists primarily to protect property and guarantee inheritance, then love was never actually the point, not originally. For most of the last several thousand years, in most cultures on every continent, marriages were arranged, negotiated between families based on land, status, alliances, occasionally livestock. The idea that two people should marry purely because they're in love is, historically, one of the newest ideas in this entire story. Historian Stephanie Kuntz has spent years tracing exactly when this shift happened, and her research reveals something almost nobody expects. Marrying primarily for love didn't become the dominant norm in the Western world until roughly the 18th century. In many parts of the world, it took significantly longer than that. For nearly 10,000 years of formal marriage, love was, at absolute best, a lucky bonus, not the reason two people ended up together in the first place. Sit with that for a second. The version of marriage most people alive today assume is the original, the traditional one. Two people falling in love and freely choosing each other is actually the newest chapter in this entire 10,000-year story, not the oldest. The version we now dismiss as cold and old-fashioned, marriage as an economic contract negotiated by families, was the default setting for almost the entire history of the institution. We didn't drift away from some pure, ancient romantic ideal and lose our way. We built the romantic version recently, layered on top of a system that was never designed with romance in mind at all. So the next time you're at a wedding, watching two people exchange rings under flowers and rented string lights, it's worth remembering what you're actually witnessing underneath all of it. A 12,000-year-old solution to an inheritance problem, dressed up in white, standing in a room full of people who mostly forgot that marrying primarily for love is one of the newest ideas in the history of marriage.